Is anybody completely new? Okay. So then you'll all probably know that we're still studying the Gospel of John. Tonight we are beginning chapter 10. As always, I'll begin with some review. And every week I try to compress the review more and more. Please be patient as we quickly review what we've already studied. Be reminded that the Gospel according to John is one of the 4 separate accounts we have in the Bible of the life of Jesus. That means it's a very important book because we only have those 4 books really that tell us of the life of Jesus, and this is one of them. This is not the only book in the Bible that was written under the authority of John the Apostle. There are 4 others, the 3 letters, 1 to 3 John, and the Revelation to John. The Revelation to John we studied in this class recently, and the 3 letters we'll study when we finish the Gospel. The Gospel according to John, like all of the books in the New Testament, was written in Greek originally, which means that it's been translated into other languages that we read and study. And it was written primarily to Christian believers like us, although few, if any of us, have a Jewish background, but many of the early readers of John's Gospel would have been Jews who came to Christ. The Gospel according to John begins with an introduction, a prologue, where we're reminded of who Jesus is, that he was the Word, meaning that he was with God in the beginning. He did what God did in the beginning. And then in the fullness of time, he came onto this earth as a man, born as a human being, just like we are, except that he had no sin. And as I often remind us, it really is necessary to understand John's Gospel correctly to remember who Jesus is, that Jesus is a man like we are, but also God. The early chapters of John's Gospel have much to do with John the Baptist. It's probably worth remembering him tonight as we approach chapter 10, because one of the subjects that we come into contact with in chapter 10 is the difference between true and false shepherds of the people. John the Baptist is a good example that we have in the New Testament of one of the godly men that God sent to shepherd people rightly. In this gospel, he introduces Jesus to Israel, and soon after he does, Jesus' ministry eclipses his own. Jesus left Judea early in his ministry and went to Galilee, which was the part of Palestine that he was from. En route, he passed through Samaria, where he had a brief encounter with the Samaritans, and spending only a couple days with them, they came to recognize him as the Savior of the world. And this is also an important study to remember as we read into chapter 10, because tonight we'll see, if we get that far in chapter 10, Jesus saying that he has sheep in Israel, but he has other sheep as well. And already we've seen in John's Gospel Jesus coming to some of these other sheep in Samaria. Jesus would come to Jerusalem for the religious festivals in chapter 5. We read of the time that Jesus came to Jerusalem and healed a man who had been unable to walk from a young age. And he did that on the Sabbath day, and as a result, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. And this is a theme that we see repeating most recently in chapter 9. We finished last week. Jesus had a similar reaction from the Pharisees when he healed a man who had been born blind, and he restored his sight on the Sabbath day. That Jesus works on the Sabbath is one of the things that confuses the Pharisees about Jesus. Well, his ministry stayed in Galilee and away from Jerusalem for a time. As we read in chapter 6, Jesus performed many wonderful signs and miracles there. He fed the 5,000, he walked on water, crowds followed him. And yet there and elsewhere in John's Gospel, Jesus tells the crowds that they're following him for the wrong reason. They notice his power, his miracles, the depth of his teaching. They're following him because they think maybe there's some earthly reward to be had. But what Jesus wants them to understand, and again this gets emphasized as we read on into chapter 10 tonight, that Jesus' reason to come was to lead people to eternal life, to set them free from their sin. Finally, in chapter 7, the narrative history of Jesus' life, as John presents it, turns away from Galilee and back towards Judea. Jesus comes down to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, begins teaching openly in the temple, and continues to have this angry reaction by the Jewish leadership, and yet God preserves his son for the time that it takes for him to proclaim his gospel and until it's time for him to die. In chapter 8, at the beginning, we have the story of how people brought a woman to Jesus who had been accused of adultery, and Jesus said to them, if you're without sin, cast the first stone, and nobody could do. In the remainder of chapter 8, we have a series of teachings by Jesus which basically help us to understand this difficult relationship that there is between Jesus and the Jews, and between Jesus and the Pharisees. In particular, finally by the end of chapter 8, they're so incensed that Jesus had to hide himself from those that wanted to throw stones at him. So in that chapter 8, we get an interesting picture. There's humanity who would punish the woman caught in adultery and also punish the sinless Son of God. And yet Jesus, who is the Son of God and without sin, is gracious and forgiving. Then until last week, and for the last 4 weeks or so, we've been in chapter 9, now finished. And I've tried to compress the review here for you in chapter 9, but it is important to remember chapter 9 because it seems that chapter 10 is just a natural, seamless continuation of what we have been reading in chapter 9. So let's remember that all of chapter 9 of John's Gospel has to do with the time that Jesus gave sight to a man who had been born blind. And you'll remember that when Jesus and his disciples first walked past the man was not looking for them. They found him, and Jesus' disciples asked Jesus why this man was born blind. Was it because of his sin or because of his parents' sin? And Jesus said, neither. It wasn't because of his parents' sin. It wasn't because of his sin. But the man was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And he said that he and his disciples had to do these works while time still remained for them to do so because the night was coming when no one could work. Jesus went ahead and healed the man. The man's neighbors, who had only ever known him as a blind man, were amazed to see him up walking around and seeing. So they took him to the Pharisees. And as I mentioned before, here, as on other occasions, this miracle took place on the Sabbath. That was the day on which Jesus opened this man's eyes. And so when the man who had been taken to the Pharisees described to them the great miracle that had been performed, it caused a division among the Pharisees, with some of them saying that Jesus must be a sinner because he did these things on the Sabbath, and others of them saying that he couldn't possibly be a sinner because no sinner could do something like he had just done in restoring this man's sight. They were divided and confused, but as for the man himself, the one to whom Jesus had given sight, he knew that Jesus was from God. He knew that Jesus was a prophet. At least that's how he understood Jesus by verse 17 of chapter 9. But the Pharisees wouldn't accept his opinion on this matter. They called the man's parents and questioned them. And because the man's parents, John tells us, were afraid of being put out of the synagogue, they answered in a sort of evasive and limited way. They confessed that this man was their son. They confessed that he had been born blind. But they said they knew nothing about how he had received his sight or who had accomplished this. And so they asked the Pharisees to ask their son directly. And when they came at the man directly, now this is the man who had been born blind, you can imagine he was under a lot of pressure there in the synagogue, being questioned by the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of the people, and yet he stuck to his story, his simple story. And in that exchange between this simple man and the Pharisees, it's interesting that the man finally said to them, I find it amazing that you can't tell that Jesus is from God. So the man understood, was beginning to understand that Jesus was from God, but the Pharisees were struggling not to accept this truth. In fact, they were angry that one such as this man, who they said had been born in sin and so forth, would presume to teach them anything, and so they cast him out of the synagogue, which is exactly what his parents had been afraid would happen. And then Jesus heard that the man had been cast out of the synagogue. Jesus wasn't involved in any of these things between the time he healed the man and the time the man was cast out of the synagogue. But now that he's been cast out of the synagogue by the Pharisees, Jesus shows up and finds the man again and explains to him who he is. And the man believes Jesus and worships Jesus. And we're supposed to see, and we do see, this stark contrast between this simple man born blind, who comes to understand and believe who Jesus is, and the wise and learned, pious Pharisees, who, despite everything, really can't accept and believe who Jesus is. And so Jesus says there at the end of chapter 9, starting in verse 39, Jesus says, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Half of this is very easy to understand. The man born blind, Jesus had made to see in two ways. First, he made him see physically. He had never seen from the time of his birth, and then he could see. But also he had given this man something even more important. You might say even infinitely more important. He'd given this man spiritual sight, by which he was able to understand the things that Jesus said about himself, accept that Jesus was the Son of Man, and worship him. It's a little bit harder to understand what Jesus meant when he said that he came so that those who see may become blind. But the Pharisees understood that Jesus was somehow referring to them in this. He said, "Do you say even the Pharisees are blind?" And Jesus said something interesting to them. He said, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, we see, your guilt remains." And I think we understand well enough that it's because the Pharisees think that they can see. They think that they're not blind. Is precisely why they're unable to see Jesus for who he is. If ever they could realize that their own light was not so great, that they needed him, then they would be able to see and understand who Jesus was. But that's where they're stuck now. They can't accept Jesus because they think that they have a light of their own. Now that review which I've just done is the jumping off place then to chapter 10, where Jesus continues teaching from this point. Before we read forward, does anybody have any comment or question about chapter 9 or any of the other chapters we've studied? Wayne?
Okay, just wondering a little bit with the man born blind there is, when he says, "Do you want to be his disciple?" I was kind of thinking that
で、めくらの人にあなたはそのめくらの人がですね、パリサイ人のあなたはイエスの弟子になりたいのかとこう言いました。
I get angry at somebody. I know somewhere in my mind I know I'm wrong, but I just can't. It's like there's a block there that I just refuse to even imagine it. If I've sinned in some way, and it kind of comes back to me. It's like a kind of reaction. And it struck me that throwing him out of the synagogue is just almost exactly that kind of behavior. But what do you think?
Well, I think I agree. I think that the part where he says, what do you want to be his disciples? And they say, no, you're his disciples. I think that's the way I read it also. It's their kind of emotional reaction to him almost accusing them, as they might think, of being disciples of Jesus, which is something that was bad, right? I mean, the men's parents said that it had been decreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue, right? And here he is seemingly accusing them of being disciples of Jesus, and they say, no, you're disciples of Jesus. I see that kind of what you say, the natural human reaction when provoked by something that may be true. When they put him out of the synagogue, I don't know. Some people see that, they just got angry and kicked him out of the synagogue. But a lot of the people think that there was more of a judicial procedure, that they had laid down the law and said if anybody were to confess that Jesus is the Christ, they'd be put out. This guy's given testimony to this great miracle, which is tantamount to confessing Jesus as the Messiah, and so they've decided more deliberately to put him out. But I can't be sure which is true.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, okay, it could be judicial too. It's just automatic, bureaucratic process as opposed to an emotional reaction.
Yeah. Anything else? Yep.
Is there a very subtle way that Jesus, first he says in the latter half of this passage that I came to judge, which is pretty much in accordance to John 5:22, and where he says God gave him the authority to judge. And then over here, so your guilt remains. So somewhere a subtle hint of his second coming, and that when he comes, then he will. I mean, it's even very clearly states that when I come next, and if I see you, your guilt remains. Then there is nothing that can be done about it. Your guilt remains.
I don't know, whether Jesus is pronouncing on the far future or not. Maybe. The only thing I'm pretty sure of is he's saying that it's because you think you're righteous that your guilt remains. Which would be true for all of us, right? I mean, if we thought we could be righteous without the grace of God in Jesus Christ by which we're saved, if we didn't think we needed that salvation, then our guilt would remain and we would die in our sin like everybody, right, without Jesus. And I think that at least he's saying that. They think that they can see, which means they think that they have a way of being righteous without Jesus, and that's the very thing that's tripping them up at this juncture. I don't know if he's saying more than that or not.
True, I guess that's kind of more ominous. He says, you are blind.
Well, I mean, yeah, and I'm skipping over the details. They're saying, what are you saying? The Pharisees are blind? And he's saying, well, you guys, the problem with you is you just don't realize your true state. That's the precarious thing that they need to realize, that they're sinners like everybody. Any other stuff? Okay, let's read on then. I'm prepared to go the first 18 verses of chapter 10. We may make it or not. We'll see how it goes. Let's start with the first 6.
イエスは彼らにこの日を話されたが、彼らは自分たちのお話になっているのが何のことだかわからなかった。
ありがとうございました。And English? Who likes to read? Okay.
Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus used to them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so first verse of John chapter 10. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. So this is a good chance for me to remind people, who may forget or don't know that in the Bible in general, as we read the Bible, the names of the Bible books, for example, the Gospel according to John, the chapters, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, the verse divisions, verse number, whatever, and surely section headings and footnotes and red letters and lots of other things that you see in your Bibles are not part of the original text that was written by the author. So these things are very useful and very convenient and even necessary for our Bible study, but they're not part of the inspired text. Okay, and the reason why I mention that is that the people who can read Greek better than I can will tell you that between chapters 9 and 10, there's no indication that the author really had any break there. The people who put the chapters together put a chapter break here, but the story is kind of seamlessly continuous from the end of chapter 9 to the beginning of chapter 10. And that's important to us just so that we remember that we should understand what we read tonight as being connected to what we have been studying in chapter 9 about the man born blind, and particularly the ending part of that, where Jesus was having the discussion with the Pharisees. Okay. One of the things we do notice here, however, and maybe this is why people put a chapter break here centuries ago, is that between the last verse of chapter 9 and the first verse of chapter 10, we have a transition from a conversation. Jesus was talking to the Pharisees. And now what we have starting in verse 1 of chapter 10 and continuing for the first 18 verses of chapter 10 is a monologue. If you did have a red letter Bible, every word between the beginning of verse 1 and the end of verse 18 of chapter 10 would be read, because Jesus just keeps speaking uninterrupted for all of those 18 verses. So tonight, I don't know if we'll cover it all, but if we do, everything that we studied tonight will be words that Jesus himself spoke. Now this monologue by Jesus begins with, truly, truly, I say to you. And in John's Gospel, when you see this, and you see it fairly often, truly, truly, I say to you, it means that Jesus is getting ready to say something that he particularly wants to emphasize and he wants people to take note of. And here I think it also suggests that Jesus is continuing and amplifying, the response that he's just given to the Pharisees in the last verse of chapter 9. That's one where he says, he told them that how does it go? If you read the last verse of chapter 9, Wayne.
If you were blind, you would have no guilt but now you say we see your guilt remains.
今あなたが見えると言いな
So
がら
if you were blind, you would have no guilt, but now we see you. But because you see, your guilt remains. And then Jesus says, the next thing he says is, truly, truly, I say to you. And so this would seem to be Jesus carrying that thought forward rather emphatically, trying to make it more possible for them to understand what they're not understanding. Okay. And at the very least, we should notice when he says, truly, truly, I say to you, it's the Pharisees that he's talking to, because that's who he has been talking to for some time. So Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and he's continuing this thought, but now he's going to talk for a while. And that's one of the things that characterizes John's gospel. It's different than the other gospels, is there are long patches of text where Jesus just talks. And this is one of them. Now notice that Jesus begins this 18-verse monologue in a way that I would call figuratively. Okay, he's talking about a sheepfold and a door and so forth and so on. He's painting a mental picture of a sheepfold, and he's discussing the ways in which people might enter and leave such a structure, right? And how you might go into and out of a sheepfold. A sheepfold is, at least it's an enclosed place where you keep sheep. Sheepfolds might have looked differently at different times and places. I think at that time in the Middle East, it would have, I read, it would have normally been a fairly low rock wall, like in a rectangle or square, that would have been high enough to keep the sheep in. And it would have, of course, had a door someplace that the people who built it wanted to come in and out of to move their sheep in and out. Some sheepfolds at other times, probably not at this time, it might have even been the enclosed courtyard of like a home, where people just bring their livestock in to keep them, anyway, where they're safe and where they can keep track of them. Jesus starts out by talking about a sheepfold. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. Okay, so I think this figurative language is in itself perfectly clear so far, right? You build a sheepfold, you put a door in it, the door is put in it so that those who rightfully own the sheep and the sheepfold can use the door to enter the sheepfold and go out of it, right? But some people might try to go in a different way, like they might try to climb over the wall. And why would anybody do that? Well, you wouldn't do that if you were the one who had the right to use the door, right? You would do that if you were a thief or a robber, Jesus is saying. That's, the proof that you're a thief or a robber is the fact that you're not going through the door that was made for people to rightfully use. You're trying to go in some secret way, some other way. So the shepherd of the sheep can enter the sheepfold by its door, and he would always do that, wouldn't he? I can't think of any reason why the shepherd would like hop over the wall when he can use the door.
What if he locked himself out?
Yeah, I don't think Jesus is splitting hairs on them. Okay, so Jesus says in verse 3, to him, that is the shepherd, the gatekeeper opens. All right, the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. So people have talked a lot about what the gatekeeper represents in this figure, and in fact, I think that you're going to misunderstand the first 18 verses of chapter 10 if you try to read it too finely in that way. I mean, the gatekeeper could be God or whatever occurs to you, but I think the point here is simply that nobody prevents the shepherd from entering by the gate. I mean, he's the one who has the right to use the gate. He can use it. Okay. And he also, in addition to being able to, the shepherd being able to use the gate when he wants to, he can also be identified because he is the one who can easily lead his own sheep out of the sheepfold. Right? He can go in the door, and he can lead his own sheep out easily. Right? Why can he lead them out easily? Because first of all, he knows them. I've read. I don't have any experience herding sheep, but I've read that shepherds actually do tend to know individual sheep in small flocks anyway. They would recognize the color and the spots and the character of the sheep. I mean, I have cats. I know what they all look like, right? I know them by name. I could probably remember 50 cats if I had 50 cats. So the shepherd, in this example, Jesus is just using a real example people would have understood. The shepherd can go in the door, and when he goes in, he can bring his sheep out easily. And the reason why he can bring his sheep out easily is because he knows each of them, and he can call them even by name. And when he does call them by name, they respond by following him out because they know his voice and they trust his voice. He's the one that feeds them. He's the one that protects them. They've heard his voice over and over and over again. They've never been harmed when they've been following that voice. You get the figure here that Jesus has, right? So we have the figure of the sheepfold and the sheep and the shepherd and the gate. Okay. Jesus is painting this word picture. Okay. And Jesus wants to make sure that we get all of the picture in our minds for the teaching that he has. In verse 4 he continues and he says that the good shepherd doesn't leave any of his sheep behind. When he comes in and he calls them by name and they follow him out, he brings them all out, right? When he has brought out all of his own, then he goes before them and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. By the way, this suggested in Jesus' mind there may be, not all of the sheep in the sheepfold are the shepherd's sheep, right? Some of them aren't. In this example, and that would have been fairly common in their time and place because people would have usually not had their own sheepfold. Like different shepherds would have all put their sheep in there. But when a shepherd gets ready to lead his sheep out, he comes in because he has a right to. His sheep are in there, and he calls his sheep, and they follow him out. But the other sheep would stay, But the good shepherd never leaves any of his sheep behind. He calls all of his own sheep out, right? And he doesn't call out any sheep that aren't his own either. He only calls his own sheep out in this example. When he has brought all his own out, then what does he do once he has them all rounded up and only his own? Is he leads them, right? So they follow him. He goes ahead of them to show them where to go, to keep them from going into dangerous places, to protect them from evils that might be out there. Anyway, the sheep follow him because they're his sheep, and because they know that they trust his voice, and they know that he's going to lead them to where the grass is green and the water is flowing, and that's what happens in this figure. Right. I mean, they all follow him because they are his sheep. That's the point. They're his sheep. So he can get them out, and they'll follow him in the way that Jesus describes, right? And it's because they are his sheep that they know his voice. He's always the one that talks to them. All right, now, my sort of comment. All of that seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? I mean, it's probably you're getting tired. I explained it too much. You read it the first time, you understood. The picture that Jesus is painting makes complete sense by itself, right? There's nothing hard to understand about the figure that he's drawing, right? Shepherds and sheep actually behave this way. And he used the example because people would have said, yeah. Shepherds and sheep behave that way, right? But Jesus is obviously not there to teach lessons on sheep herding, right? I mean, he didn't suddenly start telling the Pharisees, now, let me tell you how to herd your sheep, right? I mean, it's obvious that when he paints this picture, he's not teaching about sheep herding, right? He's teaching about something else. And you can struggle to try to keep this whole image integrated and you'll fail. Jesus uses it a few different ways, as we'll see. But one thing's really sure. Jesus is telling this figure to teach about something else. And in the figure, one thing that's really sure is the sheep represent people somehow. Right? Probably nobody's confused on that point. The Pharisees aren't confused. Nobody's confused. The sheep are people somehow. And therefore the shepherd in this picture that Jesus is painting is some type of a person, right? And the relationship between this person and the people that he leads and shepherds is similar to the relationship between a shepherd and real sheep, right? I mean, the relationship between a shepherd and sheep and the human shepherd and human sheep is something. Jesus is teaching something about that, right? Now, these people aren't coming up to this figure empty-handed, okay? They already have a lot in their mind probably they can use to begin guessing what Jesus is talking about. There are a lot of places in the Old Testament that use the example of sheep and shepherds, but one that's really major is Ezekiel chapter 34, and it's too long of a chapter to read in the class. I read it on myself today. But the whole of Ezekiel chapter 34 is basically representing God's people as sheep, and it's talking about how shepherds lead the sheep or fail to lead the sheep, and how God's finally going to have to send a good shepherd to lead the sheep. So there's a lot of Old Testament background people might have had to try to add to what Jesus is teaching now. Jesus is teaching something about how God's people are shepherded, okay? And we remember that John's gospel was written near the end of the first century. Matthew, Mark, and Luke had already been completed, probably. Likely John either had read Matthew, Mark, and Luke or parts of the raw material that went into Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk a lot about the good shepherd and the sheepfold and all of that, right? So there's Old Testament images and there's earlier New Testament images that John and his readers would have had in their mind as they listened to Jesus starting to talk about this, all right? And I just wanted to step aside and say that because as Jesus is saying this, the readers are sitting there understanding he's talking about something else using figurative language, and they have some clues as to how to interpret that kind of symbolism. But the question is, will they understand it correctly or not? Okay? So let's continue. Jesus continues. In verse 5, Jesus says, he's still working this image, okay? He's saying, the sheep won't follow a stranger, right? They'll run away from a stranger because they don't know the voice of the stranger, right? So if the sheep are in the fold and some new guy shows up or some guy who's not really the shepherd says, hey, sheep, come out, they won't come, right? Because they won't follow him. They'll be afraid of him. They'll run away from him because they don't know the voice of the stranger, Jesus says, right? So that's obvious enough. Sheep will not follow a stranger. Likewise, God's people will not follow a false god, neither will they follow a false prophet. Right? The same thing is true with sheep as it is with people. They recognize and follow only the voice of the one to whom they truly belong. It's true with sheep. Is Jesus suggesting it's true with people also? I think so. Okay. In chapter 9, which we've been reading the last 4 weeks, the man who was born blind demonstrates that he's one of God's sheep. He's one of God's people by recognizing and following the voice of Jesus. Even when he had to resist and refuse to follow the voice of the Pharisees and were threatening to put him out of the synagogue, right? And he's just a poor, used to be until recently blind beggar, right? He's now called before the Pharisees, and he just sticks to the truth. And he tells them, it's amazing to me, he says, that you don't know where this man comes from after what he's done. It was amazing to him because he heard the voice and he understood the voice, right? Because he was one of God's people, so he could understand what Jesus said to him as being true. But in chapter 9 and throughout a lot of John's gospel so far, and what will follow also, the Pharisees keep demonstrating that they're not of God, right? Jesus will often say, you're of your father, meaning the devil, right? Because they can't hear his words. He keeps saying the simple truth, and they don't accept what he says as true. Okay. Now, we're just like simple readers, in the first 5 verses of chapter 10, we've read this simple figure that Jesus has done. We haven't gone back and studied Ezekiel and all of that, but basically we kind of have it figured out, right, what Jesus is talking about, right? He's continuing from the situation at the end of chapter 9. He's saying, just think about how animals are. Think about how sheep are, The sheep that belong to the good shepherd follow him out because they belong to him. But they won't follow, somebody who's not their shepherd because they're afraid. All of these things we sort of understand, but the Pharisees don't understand. Verse 6, it says, this figure of speech, and I'm sorry, I said Jesus said every word between here and verse 18. Actually, here's a narrator's voice coming in here in verse 6. It says, this figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. All right, so this figure that we basically understand, the Pharisees didn't understand, which ironically is making Jesus' point, right? And I've said this a lot of times before, I'll say it again, like if you ever spend much time in front of like a class like this, you'll see the difference between the Christian reaction to things that you read in the Bible and the non-Christian reaction,
で
right?
すからクリスチャンのこういうバイブルクラスの勉強をしている時でも
We sort of naturally resonate with and accept and understand as true the things that we read in the Bible, but not everybody does,
で
right?
すからそのバイブルクラスを聞いて全部の人が理解するわけではない。
And the Pharisees are not
パリサイ人は
accepting what Jesus says is
理解する
true,
ことができなかったです。
although the man born blind did.
はできませんでした。
So that's the first 6 verses. Any comment or question?
まあ1節から6節までに何か質問があったら
Everyone seems very sleepy tonight. That must be my fault. Yeah.
I just want to say one thing, and if you ever have a chance to take, I once had a chance to study this with a gentleman from New Zealand who really did shepherd sheep once, and he said everything Christ says is absolutely true. You try and get a sheep to follow you that is not your sheep, and he will pay no attention to you because he knows you're not his good shepherd.
そして羊は本当にその良い羊飼いのことを
I think that's
The
important.
amen chord, that's all it is.
I think that's important.
全然違う人にはね、誰もついていけないそうです。
It's not just true for sheep, but also cattle in general. Because I've had the opportunity to man my grandfather's ranch. I mean, it's not really a ranch, but he
まあ
had
牧
this
場みたいなところ
cattle,
に
you know,
倉
and
庫がいたんですけども。
so those chaps were, you know, I was friendly, and they would recognize me they would just like a dog would recognize its master. So the sheep, the cattle, they recognize the
だから
master.
羊とか牛とかはね、本当に犬がご主人を知るように知るんです
knows
ね。
the names of the cattle and stuff.
Yeah. So you see, this simple story that Jesus is telling is really a powerful story.
イエスが使っているのは本当に力
It seems like common sense to those of you who have herded or talked to people who herded sheep or herded cattle. It's not true of geese, by the way, but anyway, I had a bad goose experience one time. But if people who were around sheep and understood these things basically because it was just part of their daily life, once you get the point, and you're going to get it if the Holy Spirit is prompting you to get it because you are one of God's people and He's helping you to get it, right? You're going to say, okay, right? The reason why you can hear God's word and believe it is because you're already one of God's sheep, right? God knew you always, and the time was coming when you were going to understand this because you're one of His sheep. And if you're not one of God's sheep, right, there's nothing to be done. Okay, so that's kind of the story that's going on here. Let's read on.
Question, Greg?
Yep.
There is a question.
3節で
Verse 3.
門番ってありますけ
This is at the gate man.
ど、でその時
Who is the gatekeeper? Is it Jesus?
Probably not Jesus.
これはイエスではないでしょう。
John Calvin says if somebody wants to think it's God, I won't object.
神、ジョン・コーラはこれは神だと言っても自分はそうではないと思います。
But probably the best answer is it's not important. It's
で、一番重要な答えは大切なことじゃないっていうこと。誰がゲートをする
気になると思う。
people who study literary genre say this is not an allegory, it's not a parable. The word that they translate parable in some translations is actually proverb. It's a sort of proverbial thing.
で、いろいろなね、こう比喩で語られているんだけど、言い伝えとかそういうものも使ったりしてるじゃないですか。
So if it were allegory, every single thing should have some other meaning, right?
で、本当はもう一つ一つ全部ミーニングがあると思われてるんですけど。
But most people who have read this carefully don't think the gatekeeper is so important. It's just the point is that the shepherd is allowed to come in and come out because he's the shepherd. Maybe. Yeah, if you tried to take all 18 verses and make the symbolism perfectly map out, you would fail because nobody's ever been able to read it that way.
ぴったり当てはまるかというとそうじゃないものがあるんですね。だからよくわかんない。
But what Jesus is teaching is not difficult to grasp, I think, as we've seen so far. You know, the point he's making is quite clear, I think, to
ポイントはそこにないので。
to people who have ears to hear it, I guess. Let's read on 7, 8, 9, and 10.
はい、じゃあ7節から、7から10まで。あ、いいよ、じゃあ読んでください。
そこでイエスはまた言われた。よくよくあなた方に言っておく。私は羊の門である。私よりも前に来た人は皆盗人であり、強盗である。羊は彼らに聞き従わなかった。私は門である。私を通って入る者は救われ、また出入りし、牧草にありつくであろう。盗人が来るのは盗んだり、殺したり、滅ぼしたりするために他ならない。私が来たのは羊に命を得させ、豊かに得させるためである。私は良い羊飼いのこの
10節までですね。はい、ありがとうございます。
Anybody want to read English? Ricky? Yeah, go ahead. Oh,
I have to see the book.
okay. Read on.
It's in Japanese.
Oh, sorry. I was just testing to see if you... If you really had the Holy Spirit, you'd be able to read that.
So Jesus again said to them, Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, we turned the heater off a while ago. Is anybody cold? All right.
Okay. Just to answer, the gatekeeper, we don't know in those days, this is just not very serious, don't take me very seriously, but in those days maybe could have been a custom where a lot of, sheep belonging to different owners were kept in a single place maybe, and so there was a gatekeeper. And so whenever the owner would come, the gatekeeper would recognize, and so one way to look at it is the gatekeeper could be God, but since we do not know, the other way could be to just look at what was in that time at history. So maybe.
その門番に関してなんですけど、
ゲートキーパー。
質問なんですけど、少なくとも私はその門番に想像する人っていうのは、イエス様が門だっておっしゃっているので、イエス様の側に、イエス様の側にいて、要するにイエス様が主人で、その主人のために仕えている存在だと思うんです。
Jesus is a master, so maybe that the gatekeeper is a kind of a servant of him.
Maybe. And in what we just read now, Jesus is calling himself the gate, right? Which is another possibility. So you can kind of decide for yourself what you want the gatekeeper to be, but I don't know. Okay, so in verse 7 now, it says, So Jesus again said to them, Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All right, so in the first 6 verses, if we've understood it at least approximately correctly, Jesus has used this figure of speech
で、まあ、1節から6節まで
And he said basically that God's people follow God's shepherds.
そして神の人たちは神の羊飼いについていくというところが1節。
And conversely, people that refuse to follow God's shepherds aren't God's people. That's the thought that he's gotten out there, I think, in the first 5 or 6 verses of chapter 10. But the Pharisees have not understood, John tells us, this figure of speech. Right? Verse 6, that's what John says, the Pharisees have not understood. So I think Jesus is coming back at this now another way, right? So Jesus again said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, right? He's tried once, now he's trying again to hammer the point that he was working on in the last verse of chapter 9, maybe. He's not just reinforcing the figure of the gate, the figure of the sheepfold that we've already talked about in class, but now he's applying that figure in a fresh and surprising way, right? At least some people find it surprising that Jesus says, I am the door, right? And not I am the shepherd, although we have been understanding Jesus to be the shepherd so far, and we will again before we get to the end of this. But right now, Jesus says, in effect, this is my opinion, Jesus says, well, let's look at this another way. Okay? We're looking at this figurative, sheepfold, but now let's look at it another way. I'm the door of the sheep, he says, all right? And already he's talked about the door of the sheepfold, right? He's been said that the door is set for the use of shepherds, not for other people. And he said that people who try to come into the sheepfold some other way, not by the door, like by climbing up some other way, he said, they're criminals. They're not shepherds. Right? And now he identifies himself with the door. So I think that this means that all of God's people and all true shepherds of God's people must pass through the door, which is Christ. He is the way, the one way. So shepherds who seek a different way into or out of the sheepfold, okay, with the sheep, are criminals and no shepherds at all. If they're trying to shepherd people and it's not the name of Christ, if they're trying to shepherd people if it's not through Christ, if they had some other idea, as the Pharisees do, about the way to salvation, then they are not shepherds of God's people. They are criminals, right? In the figurative sense here, right? They're violating God's plan, which is that there will be only one mediator between God and man, and that'll be Jesus Christ. He is the door. Okay. He says in verse 8, all who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. Now, I think the best way to make sense of this, I thought about this a long time, is to remember Jesus is in Jerusalem speaking to Jews. Later he's going to bring the subject of Gentiles in by himself, but the subject of Gentiles hasn't been brought in yet. Okay, so he's having a conversation with the children of Abraham right now, with Jews in Jerusalem. And when he says, all who came before me, he's speaking primarily, I think, like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and other people did, of false shepherds in Israel. Right? And he's meaning all of those who came before me, who sought to lead people away from God, or sought to lead people away from the one whom God had promised, that is Christ. These are the ones who are robbers and thieves. And clearly Jesus doesn't mean that every shepherd in Israel before him was a thief and a robber, right? Surely Abraham was not a thief and a robber. Moses was not a thief or a robber. David wasn't a thief or a robber. John the Baptist, more recently, in John's Gospel, wasn't a thief or a robber. All of these were shepherds in Israel, which had come before Jesus in time. Jesus is not talking about these guys, because all true shepherds that preceded Jesus were merely leading people towards Christ anyway, right? That's the way we understand salvation history, right? Is everyone, every godly person in the Old Testament, one way or another, is leading people to Christ and salvation. And so Jesus is not talking about those people, but he's talking about the very many people there had been in his day, even false messiahs, in Jesus' own day, and through the whole history of Israel, there had always been characters emerging throughout the Old Testament history you read, who were leading God's people astray and leading God's people astray and leading God's people astray. Right? And what Jesus is saying here is the people who were led astray were not God's people. God's people cannot be led astray by definition. Isn't that what he's saying? If they were led astray, then they weren't God's people. Just like the sheep, right? The sheep know who they belong to. They won't follow somebody else. They'll only follow the one that they belong to. And so Jesus seems to be saying in the history of Israel, God has sent people, ultimately Christ, but before that, Moses and all the prophets and godly kings, and some people were faithful and they followed and other people weren't, and the faithful followers were God's people. That's how you knew they were God's people, because they were faithful followers. The ones who didn't follow were not God's people.
He could be implying in a very implicit way these false shepherds would be these very Pharisees themselves.
Surely. I mean, that's obviously his primary target, right? Because that's where we started at the end of chapter 9, and it's important to keep that connection. The Pharisees are the latest example of false prophets in Israel, and the ones that are still alive to listen to him speak. And they're aware of this whole history too, right? So they've got to be feeling the heat, because they understand. They may understand to some extent what Jesus is trying to say about them, right? So, verse 9, Jesus says, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture." So this is how we know who God's sheep are. They come to God through Christ. And this is how we know who God's shepherds are. They lead people out and in only in the name of Christ. Anybody else who claims to be a shepherd and isn't doing it in the name of Christ is a false shepherd, right? Is a criminal. He's trying to enter in not through the door, but through some strange way.
The only thing there is, when he says people are led astray, how is it that, I mean, that's actually condemning them in a sense.
Where are you?
Well, let's see. The thief only comes, the sheep did not listen to them. Well, okay, yeah, but I mean, I guess it's the opposite of that. The sheep that do listen to the thieves and robbers. So
Those are sheep that don't belong to God.
I just wonder though, if there's culpability, I mean, if they can be blamed for something, then, I mean, I'm a little bit, there's sort of the impression that the thieves and robbers actually do something to mislead, I guess.
But in the passage that you quote, he's saying, but God's sheep didn't listen to that.
Yeah, well, that's.
If you just look at, jump to verse 16, if you just jump to verse 16, you would see notice Jesus says, and I have other sheep that are not of this fold. So it's just not condemning and stopping there, but he's just trying to identify that, yeah, there is the good sheep which is already kind of chosen, following, and there are the ones who have maybe never heard me. So, so even from there, they will join and become, so we will then have like one flock. So that's what 16 is saying. 16, verse 16. It's not just stopping, so it doesn't condemn and stop. So it's like just identifying another category and. I don't know what the rate of
I don't know if, are you still bothered by something?
Well, it's okay, just.
I mean, I don't.
Maybe that's another way to.
I don't think you can quite wrestle all the way to the ground. So at the time that Jesus is speaking, as we've noticed a lot of times before, hardly anybody is understanding. So, for example, the Apostle Paul is someplace standing there, and it's going to be a while before he's going to understand, right? And so that it's not always possible immediately to tell who God's sheep are, right?
Yeah.
It's a question of where do they effectively end up, and what Jesus must surely be teaching is that those who are God's sheep, that is, those that belong to Him eternally, are eventually going to hear His voice and follow Him.
I see, okay, yeah, maybe that's what's kind of bothering me there is, I mean, yeah, if they were already able to hear from the very beginning, then there's not any reason for us to preach to anybody. There's not any reason.
No, and there are a lot of people who finally come to the truth by way of, being confused by false teachers also, right? So
Yeah.
I don't think he's saying. I don't want to say. He may not be addressing all the things that are worrying you right now here. Yeah. Okay, so verse 10 says, "The thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." So shepherds who seek to lead sheep other than in the name of Christ can only kill and destroy their flocks. But to lead people to Christ and salvation is to lead them into abundant eternal life. Jesus came that they may have life and have it abundantly. It's 10 minutes before 9. Do you want to finish, or do you want to? Wait till next time? Going to finish?
Quit what you did. Well, then I mean, quit after.
Greg?
Yeah.
There is a question.
Yeah.
はい、どうぞ。
ヨハネによる福音書は
By the John the Gospel?
3番目
Was it written the third Matthew, Mark, or last?
Well,
Last.
ですね。紀元後70年代
The 70 year of AD or after that?
yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody knows absolutely for sure.
記述した時わかんないんですけど。
But I think most people would say that all 5 of the Johannian books are written very near the end of the first century, probably after Jerusalem fell in 70 AD. Probably after 70. And probably the other Gospels were written before
で
that.
他の3つの福音書はそれ以前に書かれたと思っている。
Question. In the previous ones, like 7 and 8, when he talks about he's the bread of life and he's talking to the general
命のパン
congregation,
ダとか前にそういう表現がありましたよね。
I think the general group can understand where this life abundant is coming from. It's from, he's the source, he's the spring. But in this one, in this John chapter 10,
10章は
is he now just speaking about leadership? Is he speaking about a above, not the same content as the other previous
前
chapters,
に
is
出て
each
き
little,
たその命のマークで言われていることと、ここの
Is he
主張を
targeting
導くリーダーとしてみたら
statement? I mean,
違う
he
で
doesn't-
しょうか。言ったり
it
とか
sounds different.
ちょっと違って聞こえるんですけど。
Well, I mean, it's gone from conversation to monologue, so now he's holding forth right now. His subject seems to be carrying over from the end of chapter 9, leadership, because he's speaking against the Pharisees who have just put this man out of the synagogue and are refusing to accept his testimony. So I think that yeah, he is, so far in what we've covered tonight, he's basically addressing himself to the Pharisees.
だから特に今日勉強したところは、パリサイ人に向けてのイエスの言葉。
And generally addressing himself to leadership.
だからまあリーダーシップのことも。
And I think all the things that he's taught by, about, and against the Pharisees are applicable to pastors today, right? I mean, you measure whether a person is a real pastor by whether or not they're leading people to Christ or not. If they're doing something else, then they're suspect. You measure true people of God as to whether or not they're coming to God through Christ or not. If they're trying to come some other way, then something's wrong. Same things are true here. I think we'll stop here, but in verse 11, which is what we read next, Jesus is going to say, I am the good shepherd, right? And then he's going to sort of hold himself out as the supreme example of what a good shepherd, a good pastor would look
ここ
like.
にね、グッドシェパードとグッド、それからグッドパスターが出てきますね。
So I think most people down through the centuries have read this section as relevant to a discussion of leadership in the church.
だから
Well,
教
then
会
and
の
now.
リーダーシップとして
With Jesus being the supreme example of how church leaders and Christians should be. And the Pharisees probably being one of the signal examples in the Bible of how church leaders should not be.
でパリサイ人はよくまあ取り沙汰されているのはこの良い指導者としてではないですよね。だからそれに反して誠の
And I think the whole point here, and it seems to be a hard point, because I sense we're all struggling with it, is that whether you hear Christ and the true pastors and follow them to salvation, or whether you don't, has to do with something on God's side. Right? Are you God's sheep or not? Right? The only way you ever find out is by how you respond to the voice, right? You hear the voice of Christ and respond to it or not. If you do, that means you belong to Him since before the beginning of the universe. If you don't, then not. Which is one of those hard things to think about. Okay, let's pray.